Hi, and welcome to my talk, Playable Theater, Game Design for Immersive Performance. I'm not going to do the thing where you tell people what you're going to say, you say it, and then you tell them what you said. I don't really do that. But I am going to tell you a little bit about me, because a lot of you don't know me. Some of you do know me, but you know me in very specific contexts. So I'm just going to give you like a really quick, why should I listen to this person? I have been designing games since the 1980s. I was doing virtual reality in the mid-1990s. I worked on an experimental MMOG in the 2000s when I was at Georgia Tech. I co-founded IndieCade in 2006. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But for those of you, how many people here have been to IndieCade? Oh, great. OK, that saves me a lot of trouble. We love performative, playable work. So if you think you shouldn't submit to IndieCade, you're wrong. OK. I've also done some social science work. Probably the best known is my book, Communities of Play, which is the study of online game refugees. A lot of the stuff I learned from this book is very applicable to what people here have been talking about. I moved to Boston in 2014 to work at Northeastern University and entered into what I am now calling my post-screen period. I have been making physical games, some augmented reality games, and I am now kind of fully in the performative, interactive stuff that you guys do. And part of the thing that I was noticing a bunch of stuff going on, which I'll talk about in a minute, but one of the things that I think precipitated, this slide's actually in the wrong place, but I'm just going to talk about it for a minute. In 2016, has anybody heard of this? Hamlet Mobile? Yeah, okay. So IndieCade has been trying to get performative works in the festival for a long time, and we've gotten sort of the new sports people and stuff like that, but it's really been only the last couple of years that people that come from the theater, yes, there she is, the people that come from the theater world had started showing up. And in 2016, one of those groups, which is capital W, won the Game Design Award for a essentially interactive play that's run out of the back of a van. So I thought that was super exciting, and it also made me realize something is going on, and I want to know more about it. So that's the why part of my talk. It kind of started when I was still in Georgia. I started doing live-action role-playing, and I got a book in 2009 called Nordic LARP. If anyone heard Johanna speaking yesterday, she's like the goddess of Nordic LARP. And she's the like Freya, if you will, of Nordic LARP. I kept thinking, this is so great. Here she is in the Freya room talking about Nordic LARP. But I fell in love with this book. It's like my most valued possession. I carry it around. Like if I take it to school, I hold it in my arms like a baby. It's no longer available in print, but there's a PDF. Everyone in this room, just go download it. It's free. It's awesome. Then, so I was into that, and I'm like, yeah, LARPing's cool. Everyone's kind of, it's getting more narrative and less gamey, and I like that. And then I took a road trip to New York with Stephanie, the CEO of IndieCade, and we went to Sleep No More. And I want to say, before I say this, there's been a few dissing of Sleep No More. I really loved it, but I want to just tell you about what about it kind of precipitated this new passion of mine. I went to Sleep No More. So this is just a shot of Sleep No More, and this is a shot of Gone Home. All right, so which is a video game. How many people are familiar with this game? Great. All right. So when I entered this space, I started playing a real-life adventure game. This is like from the second I walked in. I started opening drawers, looking under things, picking up teacups, trying to figure out what lipstick color they were, blah, 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 blah. And about 20 minutes in, I had two epiphanies. One was, oh, this is a play. There must be actors somewhere. And the second was, there's no actual information anywhere in this room. It's beautifully crafted. It creates amazing ambiance, but it is content-free. So those two things, and before I was in academia, I was doing theme park work, and I was like, that's great, but this could be also make this experience even better. And I also know from now talking to other people that are gamers that many other people have done exactly what I did. So the desire and expectation to engage with the space in a different way is not unique to me. The other thing that's happened to me in Boston is I've fallen in with a crowd of rough and tumble theatrical game design people. There's a group called Incantrix, which does a number of immersive / game theater things. Kellyanne Pletcher, who runs Club Drosselmeyer, which is an amazing swing dance floor show puzzle game thing. And Lizzie Stork, who was the co-editor of #Feminism, also a free PDF. Maybe it's not free, it might be cheap, but anyway, worth getting. It's a collection of amazing short LARPs. If you don't know anything about LARPs and are curious, this is a great place to start. So I sort of fell in with this crowd, and here's the slide again. And then Capital W won this award in 2016, and then I went, something's going on. So what I'm doing now is I've started an interdisciplinary cabal, let's call it, with the main goal of looking at the problem of agency in immersive performative work. And looking at all the different spaces, especially that people are talking about here, like I'm drawing a lot from escape rooms, but I feel like escape rooms don't really need what we're doing because they already kind of have a sense of how to make a certain style of agency in a certain kind of context. So I started this project. I got a small grant from my university, collaborating with a theater faculty member named Danny Snyder-Young. And then I was accepted to a residency in England at Blast Theory. Anybody, Blast Theory? Oh, good, okay. For the ones that didn't raise their hand, get to know these people. They are amazing pioneers. They made a game called Kidnap in 1998, where they held a lottery to kidnap 2 random people. I was in their studio for a month. While I was there, I went to see a Nordic LARP in London and accidentally got an invitation to Punch Drunk's Fallow Cross. I spent 2 days there hanging out with them and talking to them about this issue of agency with a bunch of other people from the local scene. The other thing that happened while I was there, are David or Lisa Spira here? So David and Lisa introduced me to an amazing guy in London who knows all of the escape owners in the entire country. And I got invited to their big summer party and met literally every single escape room owner in the UK, which was kind of fun. So I came back from that trip, and we had this Playable theater game jam. And the basic idea here was we brought a bunch of people together from games, from theater, from immersive, from tabletop role-playing, LARPing, and we spent 3 days locked in a room together, creating a shared vocabulary, doing different kinds of exercises and showing each other different techniques, and then creating collaborative projects, incubating, brainstorming, whatever. We ended up creating 4 projects, 3 of which are currently in some state of development. So, again, the focus of this was on audience agency. Oh, that's this slide. The next thing we're doing, oh, it's the same slide, isn't it? No. All right, the next thing we're doing is we're going to be starting a series of workshops which start this coming Wednesday. If you're in Boston or have any reason to be there, you are welcome to come by. We picked 3 topics that were things that came up in our conversations where we're like, these are things people want to explore more. So the first one is participatory storytelling. We're going to have 3 play tests of different narrative works, and anybody who comes can participate, and then we'll have a sort of a broader discussion about how do you make narrative participatory. We're going to do 2 more. One is on acting for participation. I think this is a very big issue because people are trained, actors are trained to ignore the audience for the most part, or at least not directly interact with them. And I've had multiple experiences where I did something an actor was not expecting, and they were like a deer in the headlights. Wait, you didn't take, I gave you a choice, and you didn't take the choice I wanted you to take? So I think that I almost feel like this is a whole new discipline that we need to start teaching students to do. And then the third one is training the audience, which is the #1 problem and concern with people from a theater background. It was a huge discussion topic at the Punch Drunk workshops I went to. The audience was often viewed as a threat. To me, the audience is an opportunity. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about game design. And some of you I know are game designers, so this will be, I'm not going to do a I don't know, high school type of game design thing. I'm going to just talk about some key principles and then just run off a bunch of terminology that I think will be super helpful to you. So this is a pretty practical talk. It might be a little bit nonlinear, but hopefully it'll be useful. I have a few caveats. This is essentially, and some of these are terms you will learn in a moment. This is a prototype that is under an iterative design process. So I want your feedback so I can make it better. Also, the art direction is horrible, so I apologize for that. Okay, so how? How do we make games? So I'm going to start with some basics. What is a game? This is a very simple, but it's a fairly universally adopted notion. A game is structured play with rules that include some kind of goal, some obstacles to that goal, some resources that help you overcome those obstacles, and consequences for your actions, which can include penalties, and I lost my other bullet point, rewards. Penalties and rewards can also become obstacles and resources. The other thing is they have variable outcomes. By definition, a game is something that can have different endings. Does there need to be a win state? This is debatable. Many people from game scholarship have devoted a lot of oxygen to having this conversation. In my mind, all you really need for something to be a game is a goal. And I'll talk a little bit more about win states and lose states momentarily. So, where are these things similar? The primary focus of both is goals and obstacles, right? That's what stories do. They tell a story of some conflict that needs to be resolved. That's what games do too. And in both cases, you get a narrative arc at the end. Where they're different, though, is that games have a variable outcome. So by definition, in a game, you don't know what's going to happen at the end. There are many adjacencies that we found in our research activities in theater and games. Theater games is the most obvious one, clearly. Process drama, which we learned from doing one at our jam, is indistinguishable from a LARP. Like, we did a process drama and we said, if you had said this was a black box LARP, we totally would have thought you were telling the truth. So that was really a big, that blew everybody's mind. Theater of the Oppressed, which is a format that works with political, is my mic okay? No, I'm just cheering for the oppressed. Oh yeah, Theater of the Oppressed. 3 cheers for Theater of the Oppressed. Yes. It's kind of, it actually connects to Games for Change. I think we had some talks about that this morning as well. Devised theater, which is a very process-oriented way of creating a show. And improv theater, which is kind of related to theater games. And then if anyone is a nerdy, scholarly geek like me, if you've read any performance studies, you will know that many of the luminaries like Goffman, Schechner, Winnicott, Turner, etc., write about play, ritual, and theater as all part of one big family of activities. So a principle that's come up a couple times in some of the game talks, which is a sort of highfalutin theoretical construct, but it's kind of important, is the idea of the magic circle. This is, I think, very porous. And if I had another 2 hours, I would give you a lecture on Irving Goffman and the magic circle, but I'm not going to do that. However, So the magic circle is just basically the invisible boundary that says, we're now playing a game. It's also sometimes called the play frame. There is a social science theory called frame analysis, which is one of the most useful things I've ever encountered in my work. And it has to do with social context. And so if you think about these things more broadly, you basically have a bunch of different, the magic circle is one frame within other frames, etc. So this is a useful thing to think about social engineering, basically. Now, one of the things that has really struck me in the last 24 hours since I've been hanging out with you all is this is a tricky problem because immersion is really trying to get you out of yourself, whereas agency asks you to perform a task. And so to some extent, you could almost argue that agency is completely counter to immersion. I'm not sure I agree with that, but it's certainly, if you think about sort of Brechtian ideas about theater and stuff like that, it is a possible concern. So now I'm going to teach you some terms, some concepts, and some processes. I'm going to go very fast. I was listening to Johanna yesterday, and I'm like, yeah, I'm just going to bombard you with a ton of information, and hopefully you'll absorb like a quarter of it. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about, so this is how to think and talk like a game designer. So if you say these words, if you go to a game conference and you just drop these words in cocktail parties and stuff, people will totally think you're a game designer. All right, so process. I think this is a really important concept. We use it a lot when we teach. Verb-based design. Start with verbs. Verbs are agency, basically. So what do you want players to be doing? This is a really good way to think about how to create audience participation, agency, etc. Now, the list I showed you where I talked about all the different elements, the rules of the game or the sort of form that those rules take are called game mechanics. Say it with me. Game mechanics. Great. A core mechanic is the central premise of the gameplay. Has anyone played Donut County? Yeah. Central mechanic, you are a hole that things can drop into. And the bigger things that you go in, the bigger the hole gets, etc. The whole game is based on that core mechanic. It's one of the easiest things to describe. So that's a really important concept because it's essentially the shape of the experience you want the players to have. There is this slogan whose attribution is multifarious. Several people have said this. But basically, the mechanics are the message is the idea that you should be telling the story or the content you want to convey with your game mechanics, not with a lot of gratuitous narrative frills. I'll talk a little bit about that. I might have actually cut my slide about that out, but I might talk about it anyway. There are many different ways to think about game design, but the one I like the best, and I didn't put this in the slide, but Tracy Fullerton has written probably the definitive book on how to do this. Player-centered. So make your game creation player-centered. This is something that I think is really interesting because it's sort of counter to the idea of expression. So like I was trying to explain to someone the other day why game design is kind of this weird hybrid between film and design, because we actually care about the end user in a way that people who paint or make films or express in some way, like people don't play test their novels, right? So that's a very particular way to think about things and a very particular way to make things. So one of the things we do from very early on is we make prototypes. We try to make them, I always say, early and often, so and as cheaply as possible. One of the big mistakes my students often make is they'll art direct their whole game before they play tested the game mechanics. Bad idea. You should do it the other way around. You can do this with paper. You can do it with cardboard. You can do it with object artifacts. I've done it with fishing poles. I mean, there's all kinds of weird ways to prototype things. And the cheaper way you can do it, the better. And then you'll be iterating. So you'll be making, remaking, throwing out, remaking, etc. And along the way, you will be playtesting. So that means you'll be bringing in people. This is not dissimilar from the theatrical concept of workshopping, I have recently learned. But you'll basically be having potential players, you'll be running stuff by them, you'll be getting them to try different things. If you have a fight, this is a great thing I will say. If you are having a disagreement with your collaborators in a game design process, playtesting is the best way to resolve it. Because if we have two different ideas, we're just going to let the players tell us which one is the best one, right? So those are all kind of the basics of how we do it, what we make, and how we make it. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about games and narrative. So there has been a long-standing debate among scholars and creators about, are games narrative, are they not narrative? Nobody cares about that anymore. We know that there are games that are narrative because we made them. Anyway, so if you're making a narrative game, the first thing you really have to think about is the story world. And the story world is essentially the characteristics of the fictional world you're creating. And this can be, my ideal scenario is your story world should be very well aligned with your game mechanic in an ideal world. So you want to make sure that whatever the gameplay is going to be reinforcing the story and vice versa. So, and this can get, you can get into a lot of minutia with this, but I think this is some of what sort of frustrated me with the Punch Drunk scenario when I was looking at Sleep No More, because I felt like the story world was aesthetically brilliantly articulated, but like I didn't understand what the rules of that world were. So I'm going to talk about basically 4 or maybe 5, I think there's 5 different types of stories that are usually seen in games. The first one is a branching narrative. This is a relatively linear story, but it allows you to make choices as the story moves forward. It's fairly low agency, but if done well, it can be incredibly satisfying. The primary verb for this particular type of experience is going to be choose. I'm putting a few examples up here. This is an interactive cinema piece that I saw when I was in the UK over the summer called Choose Your Own Documentary. It is a documentary about choose your own adventure games. The audience all have remote controls. There is a live host who is also the person in the film, who is the central figure of the person making the film. And what they did was they asked the audience to make choices on behalf of the filmmakers. And some of those choices had rather profound ethical consequences. So even though it was very low agency in some ways, it was extremely satisfying because it was so well crafted, and the conceptual relationship to the story they were telling and what they were telling the story about was so solid. Okay, spatial storytelling. This is using space to convey narrative. A lot of people have been talking about this weekend. It's come up again and again and again. This is a medium form of agency. Its primary verb is explore. It's used a lot in puzzle games and mysteries and even linear media, like if you saw Murder on the Orient Express is a great example of kind of some spatial storytelling elements. A lot of games, by the way, will use multiple of these techniques. And the primary verbs, as I said, are explore and discover. And this is just a shot of the old Disneyland attraction, Swiss Family Robinson Treehouse, which has since been bastardized into many other licensed properties. But it does a really good job of using space to tell a story. It also uses another technique, which I will talk about next, which is called forensic storytelling. This is also a theater term, right? I've heard theater people use it. This is basically, as a viewer or a player, I'm trying to figure out what happened after the fact, based on clues and information that I'm given. So that's kind of has a medium level of agency because it involves a little more active engagement. It involves verbs like investigate and connect. And the example I'm giving here is actually a San Francisco classic, the Jejun Institute. Anyone? Brilliant, also won an IndieCade award. This is a game, it's an alternate reality game where clues are spread out all over the city. And it's brilliant. And if you want to know more about it, I highly recommend this film, The Institute. Next, puzzle stories. I think this bears some more delving into than I did for this talk, but I'm just going to say that puzzle stories are pretty much what all escape rooms are, which is environments where you solve puzzles to uncover aspects of a narrative. Or sometimes it's just solve puzzles to solve more puzzles, but the narrative and the puzzles have a relationship to each other in an ideal situation. This is also medium to high agency. A lot of puzzle stories have this characteristic where solving a puzzle actually causes something to happen in the world. I went to see The Time Trap, which is a UK-based. When I got invited to this party because of David and Lisa, of all these UK escape room designers, and every single one of them told me this was the best one in the UK. So I took, I mean, literally, like, I was at this party, and they all said, "Have you seen Imaginarium?" It's based on Alice in Wonderland. I went to see it. It is really great. If you're in the UK, you should go check it out. What they did a really good job of integrating the story and the puzzle. It's a sort of deconstructed Alice in Wonderland. They also used a bunch of other techniques that I'm going to talk about further in this download. And finally, we have procedural storytelling. And this is the type of storytelling that really produces the highest level of agency. And this is stories that are constructed through the enacting of rules. It sounds like a fancy word. It's borrowed from computer science, but it's basically like you give people some guidelines and rules to follow. They go through those processes, and they end up having created a narrative. This is basically what LARPs do. It's also a big part of tabletop role-playing games. I just threw up a few things here. Romancing Jan is a LARP set in a ball in a Jane Austen novel that essentially proceduralizes the courtship process. Will That Be All is a tabletop role-playing by a British creator named Graham Walmsley. It is loosely based on the servants in Downton Abbey. And Forsooth is a really great tabletop game that essentially simulates a Shakespeare play. So these are some examples of how you can create procedural narrative. Whatever form you choose, I'm kind of a stickler for this. You really want the players to have consequential agency. They need to feel like, and actually Johanna said something really good yesterday, which was they just have to feel like they have agency. They don't necessarily have to have it. I prefer if they have it, but if they can't tell the difference, it might be fine. The other thing I want to talk about is this question of winning. Hardcore gamers think you have to win games. I disagree with that. I think it can be really fun to fail, and really well-designed experiences have a really outstandingly fun fail state. These two, the bottom one is a game called Fiasco by Jason Morningstar. Yay, and fans, good. And this is a game that was specifically designed to explore the fun of failure. Its goal is to make its design goal is to make you feel as if you're in a Coen Brothers movie. And at the end, everything goes spectacularly wrong in a really fun way. And as we know, as many people here are storytellers, probably, how many people here consider themselves somehow storytellers in one way or another? So everybody. Okay, great. So as you know, in theater and drama and film, it's really fine if characters don't get what they want. In fact, sometimes it's way more interesting. So game designers or game players are sort of obsessed with winning, but storytellers, not so much. The top one is Kellyanne Pletcher Adams' Club Drosselmeyer. The first year she ran it, one of the groups made a choice which caused everyone, including the audience, to all die at the end. Everybody was talking about it for months afterwards. So, and then training the audience. And this is kind of, to me, this is the biggest nut to crack. I don't know, somehow maybe papers and books will get written about it by our group. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ways you can on-ramp and train your audience, as well as some possible problems and ways to think about avoiding them. So a few people have mentioned indexing. Also, Johanna mentioned it yesterday. This is super helpful. If you can reference some other content or some other story that people know, it makes your job a lot easier. Weirdly, Shakespeare is like the most adapted into immersive things that I know of. Also, possibly a book. So if you're adapting something with Shakespeare, let me know. And there's the blockbuster LARP. One of the biggest blockbuster LARPs in the Nordic scene is this College of Wizardry, which is loosely based. It's basically where you go after you graduate from Hogwarts. So they have a lot of their work is done for them by indexing. It's like, okay, these people know what they're supposed to wear, they're in college, they're all Harry Potter people, and so 50% of your onboarding is done by indexing. Another is, not everybody uses this term, but I think it's useful, scaffolding. So this is like create a social context. So this is the university, like I'm in college, suddenly I know what I'm supposed to do. Or I'm at a wedding, I know I'm supposed to dress up fancy, I know I'm supposed to sit at a table, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's also onboarding. So in LARPs, onboarding is often a very long and somewhat arduous process. You might have to do 4 hours of workshop before you do 2 hours of LARP. You might get, as I have, a 30-page character sheet in email that you're expected to have memorized by the time you do a LARP that lasts 3 hours. So this is way too much overhead. This is a thing we need to fix. One interesting thing about LARPing to realize is that a lot of the LARP warm-up exercises look exactly like theater games. And some of them actually are theater games, but they follow a lot of the same characteristics, trying to get people embodied, getting them to follow, create gestures based on characters and things of this nature. The next term I'm going to talk to you about is, for people I know from theater, like the most useful thing I have told them. Pretty much across the board. How many people have heard this term before today? Okay, good. Oh, great. Fantastic. So yeah, basically, you want to try to keep whatever you're doing to me, if you're going to do something with a mass audience, you really need your onboarding to be inside the game world, so a diegetic process rather than extra diegetic. The image I'm showing you here is, this is the World of Warcraft interface, which is horrifyingly extra diegetic. And this is the interface for the online game Uru, which is based on Myst, in which there is nothing on the screen unless you click on corners and bring stuff up. But basically, you're in the world the whole time. I think it's really important to have a player role. If you don't have a player role, then the player is going to just make up their own thing, which might not be the thing you want them to make up. So it doesn't have to be a very elaborately construed character, but they ought to know what they're doing there. When they get into the space, who are they? What is their relationship to the story? This is also called an alibi if you use Nordic LARP terminology. So what is my alibi? Why am I here? Tutorial levels, and particularly diegetic tutorial levels, are very common in video games. And this is an introduction that teaches you something about the game world and how to interact with it. My favorite example of this is from Save the Munbacks, which was designed by Kellyanne Pletcher Adams and Lizzie Stark. This is a plant, and this whole sequence puts a lot of these things into play, so I'll just quickly... Yeah, so basically you show up, you get a discipline as a wizard that you're going to be focusing on. If you do botany, you go to this plant class. She asks you to pot plants, and as you're doing so, the plants start to yell at you. So you pick them up, and they're like, "It's cold, put me back in the dirt." And later on in the game, you find out that the plants are going to give you valuable information because they can talk. Super seamless and really nice. Non-player characters and player characters, I think everybody kind of knows what those are. We've talked about them a lot this week. I want to just take a couple minutes to talk about emergent behavior. So this is unanticipated player behavior. This can be good or bad. One thing to be aware of is that these have directly to do with affordances of your experience, what you are able to do in the world as opposed to what you are supposed to do. People will do anything they can. So if you allow them to unscrew a light bulb, they will unscrew a light bulb. I can guarantee it. Now, emergent behavior pushes up against these affordances in different ways, and sometimes these ways are very positive, like this is Westeros rendered in Minecraft. Kind of epic. Or Black Panther or Journey cosplay, also kind of epic in its own way. But there's also a darker side, and the best and funniest example is the Diglett meme that emerged out of Pokemon Go, and this is an example of this is a real technical term in games, the TTP, which means time to penis. So this is how much time it takes people to make a penis in your environment. It's a very useful concept, and you can avoid it by creating affordances that make it difficult. Like, why have a Diglett in this game at all would have been my question. It can also take the form of griefing and harassment, and a few people have talked about the importance of player curation. It's really important to think about some social engineering about who's there, because a bunch of 10-year-old kids are going to behave differently than a bunch of drunk college people or men or women or whatever than your grandmother. So it's just something to think about. It also helps with the indexing and scaffolding because that can help give people some constraints. And I think this is really important because griefing is a thing we know happens in immersive theater. And that was something I was talking to Punch Drink about. I'm like, yeah, I'm a game scholar. Like, if you make people anonymous, some of them will act out. It's just a given. So that's something to be aware of. Like, you put masks on people, you're sort of, in a way, asking for some trouble. Maybe you want that kind of trouble, I don't know. Anyway, my last admonishment to you is, I think it's a good idea to hire a game designer if you want to make agency in your environment. Yes, game designers, raise your hand. Game designers for hire, anyone here? Oh, well, maybe too many, I don't know. I just found out last night that Meow Wolf just hired a very highly acclaimed LARP writer who may be here. Is Shoshana here? No. Okay, great. So it's not a bad idea. There's a lot of indie developers around who would love to help you. And finally, please submit your game to IndieCade. We love you, and we want you there. All right. Do we have time for, like, a couple of questions? One or two questions? I get a little kind of, all right. Yeah. Hi. Yeah, we have a very elaborate process for making sure that everything gets juried. So we will basically send our spies to your venue or to an event where your piece is being shown, and or sometimes we'll do it based on documentation and get feedback from people who've already seen it. So we basically have figured that out. Yes. So okay, this is the next 1-hour lecture I give. The magic circle is very porous. And here's a great example. Has anyone seen these weird antique-looking floppy disks? Someone has launched an ARG at this event. If you see these, they're part of the ARG. So this is blurring the reality and the magic circle. And that's a thing that a lot of game designers like to mess around with. So it doesn't have to be distinct. 5 more minutes. So I'm going to get someone else. Okay, we can talk afterwards, maybe. I just want to give other people a chance. Yeah. I guess I would say it's case specific. As Johanna would say, it's bespoke. We have to create our own application of it depending on the circumstances. Way in the back. It's my personal bias. I like it. I've had some of my most interesting experiences in LARPs where I had a lot of agency. And so, some people, I don't think you have to have agency. Like, you can make a perfectly good immersive experience with no audience agency. It's just something I'm passionate about, and I want to help people do better. Yes? Yeah, so another maybe 2-hour talk would be on the word immersion, which is bandied about in many different ways by many different people, sometimes weirdly, not really well. Like, it's an immersive game. Not really. If you're just looking at a screen, it's arguable. So it gets into semantics a little bit, but I was thinking of it more in terms of sort of the theory in theater, that flow. It's like Brecht had this thing about he wants you to remember that you're watching a play. So if you're really engrossed in something, you might forget that it's not real, which is not really true. Humans have much more sophisticated brains than that, but. Yeah, I think it's something that people worry about. The other thing I didn't talk about, which relates to this, is the idea of control. And a few people have been talking about like how actors control the audience in these, or how you feel like you can maintain aesthetic control when you're letting the audience do stuff. That is the rub. Like figuring out, I want this to go a certain aesthetic way, and the audience members could fuck it up unless I somehow craft it appropriately. And that is game design, basically. Do we have time for one more? Are we done? Are we? Okay, yeah. That's a stylistic choice, just like if you want to make a film that's realistic or that's magical or whatever, you know. I mean, there are people at Nordic LARPs where they play historical scenarios where you literally have to have like the right kind of button on your shirt. And, you know, that's a high fidelity kind of experience down to these abstract black box things where everything is metaphorical. We had one in the back there. I think you had your hand up. I feel like that's also really specific to the context and what you're trying to create, and the level of control that you give up versus, you know, there are a lot of interesting ways, like Nina Runesendrop, who's very well known for this very abstract style of Nordic LARP, puts people in a black box with white balloons, and that's it. You know, and then she gives them some parameters, and then they do something that she doesn't even intervene in. And I have exactly 0 minutes left. So I thank you very much.